Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Twitter Spaces conversation about the Italian election, which is coming up on Sunday. Thank you to James there for setting up all the technical parts. If you have any questions you want to ask, please tweet them below the main Euronews tweet about the Spaces, and James will let us know a little bit later. I'm David McDougall, a journalist at Euronews, and joining us live today we have Giorgia Orlandi, Euronews correspondent in Rome. Andrea Carlo is a Euronews journalist, also based in Rome, and documentary filmmaker Annalisa Piras is lending her expertise as well. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you for having us.
And just to set the scene, the election is on Sunday. Essentially has a left-wing bloc of parties, a right-wing bloc, and then one sort of non-binary political party that doesn't want to identify as left or right. And if we dive right in to the elephant in the room, for me at least, about what brought us to this point, Giorgia, if I can start with you. Italy seemed to have a perfectly good government with Mario Draghi as prime minister. It was one of the more competent governments Italy's had in a while, lauded for the post-COVID recovery work. It encompassed a broad coalition, and yet his coalition partners pulled the rug from under him. That seems like a self-inflicted wound almost. Can you just tell us a little bit about how we got to this point with poor Mario Draghi? And you have to unmute yourself as well. Are you there, Giorgia?
Yes, I am. Can you just please repeat the question? Sorry, I wasn't had some technical problems there before. So
no worries. It's just like, how did we get to this point? Mario Draghi seemed to have like a really well-functioning government, lauded especially for its post-COVID recovery work. How did we get to the point where the coalition partners pulled the rug from underneath his feet, really?
Well, the whole operation of putting together such a varied coalition that, as we know, actually included different parties with different backgrounds was a risky operation indeed. Mario Draghi was appointed prime minister by Sergio Mattarella with a specific mission: help Italy's economy recover after the pandemic, but most importantly, manage EU COVID funds as a one-off chance for the country, really, to invest in infrastructures and in other different sectors. So it was a very risky operation. Mario Draghi tried his best, really, to keep the coalition together. But as he realized that political infighting would be simply putting such experiment at risk, there were no more conditions to be able to go forward. Then he decided to step down. So clearly, this was Mario Draghi's decision, as he realized that, because let's remind ourselves that he won the confidence vote, but simply the fact that his majority would be a weaker majority in the coming months, that's the reason why he decided that he was not able to lead the government anymore. So we've seen these throughout the years. This is a specific feature of Italian politics. And that has to do with the way the electoral system is working, and the way actually a parliament works as well, to have such a varied and so many parties forming the majority in parliament. And yes, and that's the main reason why we got to this point. Just one last comment about why this was completely unexpected. Well, reason being that this has been so far a very unusual electoral campaign indeed.
And Andrea, if I could ask you, last week in the Swedish elections, we saw turnout of almost 80%. Is this an election that Italians are excited about? Will we see similar numbers like that turning out to vote in Italy, or is there a bit of voter apathy?
I think it's a very different situation in this case. So first of all, having a summertime election in Italy is extremely unusual. It's the first time we're having an election campaign in August, which is Ferragosto in Italy, so generally a time when Italians go to the seaside and don't really want to think about politics. Already seeing that around 40% of the eligible electorate is not planning on voting. So I think that there's an overall sense of fatigue and frustration. It's been a difficult past 2 years. I mean, Italy's been battered by the COVID pandemic. And of course, now we've got the situation in Ukraine, which is having repercussions on all of Europe and on Italy especially. So I think there's this general sense that the people don't really want to go to the polls again. But of course, from at least, the sort of centre-left progressive side, there is this fear of having a far-right government if, as is likely, Giorgia Meloni gets elected. So the centre-left is hoping that it can rally young voters and get them to vote. But overall, I would say it hasn't really been a particularly engaging election season, and the overall feeling that Italians have is just one of here we go again. Here's another government that is collapsing. We've had 67 governments since the end of the war, so it sort of feels like another deja vu.
It's time for a 68th government. You could never have too many governments. And we are going to dive into a lot of responded. Giorgia was saying they're looking at some of these issues like the EU structural funds. But Andrea, you also touched on something there, if I could ask Annalisa about. The headline of these elections really is that Italy might well have its first female prime minister in Giorgia Meloni. And maybe that's a name some of our listeners might be hearing for the first time today. What can you tell us about her and her party, the Brothers of Italy, Annalisa? And don't forget, you have to take yourself off mute if you want to speak. Well, maybe we have lost Annalisa along the way, so I'll go back to Andrea on that, if you don't mind picking up, Andrea. What can you tell us about Giorgia Meloni and how she's got to this position here, poised to be the next Prime Minister of Italy, the first female Prime Minister, and from a party that's really, it's had its ups and downs over the years, but has really surged in the polls and in popularity?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got to consider that, our Brothers of Italy, her party, barely scraped 4% in the last election. But one thing that I think is very crucial that people should be aware of is the political baggage which Giorgia Meloni carries. She is not some sparkly political debutante as she's often portrayed, but she comes from a long tradition that ultimately has its roots in neo-fascism. And I think, in a sense, she's the kind of Janus of Italian politics. On the one hand, we see the Giorgia Meloni of, that we see on TV in political debates, which is a relatively palatable national conservative that kind of tapped into the mood of the Italian public and is offering, promises in terms of how she's going to deal with the rising costs of energy bills and to deal with, post-COVID recovery and everything. And then we have the Giorgia Meloni we see within her kind of political sphere, like the Giorgia Meloni who spoke at the Vox rally in Spain, who rallied against Islamic violence and LGBTQ lobbies and things like that. So in a sense, I think she's somewhat of a chameleon, but she's really managed to carve herself a space in Italian politics, also by being part of the opposition, not being part of the big coalition government under Draghi, and has been able to really understand the dissatisfaction that Italians have been feeling for years, and that has contributed to her rise. But I think it's important that people know that she isn't a newcomer to politics. She's been a minister. She's been involved in politics for over 2 decades.
And Giorgia Meloni's, I'm being very careful, Giorgia, not to confuse your last name with Giorgia Meloni's last name as well. And that's, I'm going to have issues with that all during this conversation, making sure I get it just right. But Giorgia Meloni party, they have significant support from prospective voters, doing very well in the polls. Can it be that so many Italians would be comfortable for supporting a party as we heard there from Andrea, with fascist roots? Or is that something that only bothers journalists like us, like me, from outside Italy, whereas in Italy, perhaps Meloni and her party have done enough to distance themselves from fascism and from Mussolini?
Well, Giorgia Meloni, this time around, is trying to present herself as more conservative rather than Eurosceptic. She's been trying to present herself as a more moderate type of leader, and perhaps also a more pro-NATO in a way, trying to appeal to a different range of voters this time around. So she's gaining on two sides here. On the one hand, clearly she can rely on usual voters, those people, as Andrea was saying, who actually have appreciated the fact that she has been rather consistent with her decision. She did not want to be part of that ruling coalition with other parties. She said it, and she maintained her promise. On the other, we've seen that she's been trying to appeal to different voters this time around, perhaps trying to appeal also to those people who are somehow or are still rather undecided, who perhaps supported Mario Draghi's leadership, and they are now trying to, they think that they might want to give it a go. Let's not forget that she somehow to many represents the new, for the first time, we might have a female prime minister. And also touching on that fascist kind of like her fascist roots. Well, it's quite interesting as clearly this is a bit like the elephant in the room. If you have noticed, Enrico Letta, the leader of the Democratic Party, hasn't quite used that issue as a way to confront Giorgia Meloni. He's been rather careful about that, and so overall, it seems that the issue of the party's fascist roots has somehow been sidelined. But also, if you remember, she's been criticized for not wanting to remove the flame from the party's official logo. And she's been really vocal about trying to distance herself from that sort of tradition. And she defended herself by saying no, we don't have any links with fascism whatsoever. And that's still part, as I said, of her trying to introduce herself as a more moderate type of leader.
And if I stick with you, Giorgia, as well, where does the Brothers of Italy get their support? So who is their typical voter? Is it socioeconomic? Are they defined by geography? Who are their voters? Especially if, as you say, they're trying to make themselves maybe less radical, more mainstream, more of a European conservative style party in Italy. Who are voting for her?
Well, I think she can still rely on usual voters, people who have been very much in line with policies for a few years. And I'm talking about certainly Eurosceptic Italians, people who, were not really, did not agree with Brussels-led policies. And I'm talking about also when it comes to the pandemic, the fact that many of her voters certainly were people who, or are people who back at the time were actually against the so-called Italy's Green Pass. We all remember that, Italy's certificate that would allow people to sort of like access venues and access public transport. So certainly the majority of people who vote for Brothers of Italy are those people who are, as I said, against Brussels-led policies, against the EU, and against COVID rules, and also let's not forget that one of the features that certainly has made her a successful leader is her charisma, her being able to be authentic, to identify herself with, I would say, average Italians, average families who are simply, they call themselves like tired of Draghi's leadership, of whatever has been suggested by Brussels, as I said before. At the same time, as I was saying earlier, she's been trying to also appeal to more moderate voters, perhaps new voters, that she will try as a way for her to increase support.
And Andrea, maybe if I could ask you next, when we look on the flip side of that political coin, or the center, it looks like, looking to the left or the center, it seems like they've been unable really to effectively counter this broad right-wing coalition that's been built. They haven't been able to break through with policy ideas that appeal to voters. What's your analysis there, Andrea, on how Italy's left wing have been coping or responding to the Meloni factor, if you will?
I think that there are a mixture of factors at play. And the first thing, as Giorgia was saying, is the Giorgia Meloni. I also want to make sure I distinguish the two very clearly. Giorgia Meloni is someone who manages to appeal to, kind of the sort of salt of the earth Italian, so to speak, with her charisma. And she combines a very effective form of identity politics. Her speech 3 years ago saying, "I am Georgia, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a Christian," became a kind of motto for her. But at the same time, she combines that with policies and a manifesto that aims to, give a certain value and importance to Italian small businesses and sectors that have felt marginalized. I think the center left in general, at the moment, just lacks the same kind of charisma that she has. Also, it has an association with past governments, because center left has been, excluding the short Northern League and Five Star Movement coalition, but has been in the major coalitions for around a decade and is seen as responsible for austerity and some of Italians' economic hardships. So it's really struggled to detangle itself from that institutional image, that idea of being part of this European bureaucratic Brussels framework that, in general, a lot of Italians are tired of, especially Italians from sort of demographic and socioeconomic sectors that she appeals to.
So, Andrea, although you were saying earlier that Giorgia Meloni is not some kind of ingenue, she has been around in politics, she's been a minister before, it does seem that she offers something more fresh, something a bit different that the voters are not tired of, in the way that they seem jaded with some of these centre-left governments, these politicians and personalities and parties that have been around for a while. She is offering something new, at least, and maybe bringing new voters to her party.
Yes, she's straddling a very fine line in that on the one hand, she's presenting herself as a credible, institutionally approved sort of figure, unlike Matteo Salvini, her right-wing coalition colleague, who is somewhat seen as being a bit too populist and as having been somewhat tactless in the way he dealt with and talked about the COVID pandemic. And so she's seen as a credible, authoritative figure, but at the same time, she's also seen as a somewhat disruptive force. And she's really managed to find that sweet spot, which is very appealing to a lot of people, a lot of voters.
And Giorgia, when we're talking about personalities and being disruptive forces in Italian politics, it probably doesn't get any bigger than Silvio Berlusconi. And he's back again this time round, now with TikTok. So what is the enduring appeal for him with voters, even after all the scandals? And let's face it, Berlusconi is known for the scandals. That's what people, at least outside Italy, remember about Berlusconi. So why he keeps turning up again? Why is he so enduringly popular, perhaps?
Well, I think Giorgia Meloni this time around, and then I will come back to your question. Giorgia Meloni has to be really careful because clearly I think one of the main challenges she's now facing is to be able to keep this coalition together, because clearly, and coming back to the Berlusconi's question, well, Berlusconi, yes, has been involved in several scandals, also that included women as well. So clearly, there's a share of perhaps voters who support the right-wing coalition, and among them there are certainly women who perhaps are not really that much approving of Berlusconi's presence. Berlusconi, I think, has to be seen more as a sort of like as an element that is useful, that is going to be part of this coalition. But I don't think that Berlusconi's political influence is as great as it used to be. And in fact, I think it's rather seen over here as a sort of like, oh, here we go again, oh, now he wants to appeal to younger voters. But it seems that really people are now having a laugh, really, rather than actually taking him seriously. And I think Berlusconi's age is definitely past, and I think we should look at it as an important chapter of Italy's history, but something that I think is now over. And the proof of that is the fact that Giorgia Meloni is something completely different, and that clearly marks perhaps is going to mark the end of that Berlusconi's era and Berlusconi's political legacy in a way. But yes, obviously, I think what we've seen this time around in terms of like political campaign strategies is a lot of like a great use of social media, and political leaders really trying to use it in the same way, in the same effective way. In fact, one of the things that we've noticed during this political campaign is the fact that we've seen leaders definitely less on public squares and more online, campaigning online. If you think that the first and last political debate between the two main leaders, Meloni and Letta, was hosted by Il Corriere della Sera, and it didn't take.
Well, if you're just joining us, thank you. Great to have you listening in to our Euronews Twitter Spaces about the upcoming Italian general election. I'm David McDougall, a journalist at Euronews in Lyon, and joining me today we have Giorgia Orlandi, Euronews correspondent in Rome, Andrea Carlo, a Euronews journalist also based in Rome. And if you have a question for Giorgia or Andrea, please send us a tweet, and producer James is looking out for those. Now, we've been talking about some of the personalities and the parties involved in this really fascinating Italian election, which is coming up on Sunday, the 25th. But let's take a look at some of the themes of the election, the political themes. If we could start off with one with Andrea, a theme that's relevant to people all across Europe, and that, of course, is the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis. Italy, I'm sure, no less impacted than other countries when it comes to how much people are feeling the squeeze, feeling the hurt of the cost of living crisis and the cost of heating their homes or turning on the lights, Andrea.
Yes, absolutely. It's a major concern for a lot of Italians. There was one recent poll from Utrend that said that 90% of Italians are deeply concerned about this. So, of course, it's been a major issue in this election. And the thing is that it's rather messy in that it's quite hard to understand what the different parties are suggesting as solutions. They talk about different things they're planning on doing. And the thing is that I'm not sure the Italian public is 100% sure of what's ultimately going to happen. And we're talking about bills possibly multiplying by 2 to 3 times. If we look at the centre-right, for instance, they talk about decoupling energy prices, so natural gas and renewable sources, and also a push towards more self-sufficiency, for instance, nuclear energy, while the centre-left talks about caps. All of the major parties emphasize the importance of having a European-wide solution to this. But it's an issue that I think is provoking a lot of confusion and rightly also a lot of concern among the Italian public.
And one of the other issues, of course, that everybody in Europe is impacted with by one way or another, Georgia, is the war in Ukraine. And traditionally, some of these, Italian political parties and politicians have had close links with Putin, with the Kremlin, have been a little reluctant to support sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. Has that shifted in any way because of the way the war is going and because of public sentiment in Italy? Has there been maybe stepping back from that closeness with the Kremlin?
Well, yes, indeed, in a way. We heard what Matteo Salvini said recently in the past few days. He said that he's changed mind about Putin, and clearly as a way to sort of like prove that he's now trying to distance himself from perhaps his past stance on the matter. And I think this is going to cause perhaps a few issues within the right-wing coalition. We all remember Giorgia Meloni's gesture when recently in a debate that was also joined by Salvini. They were discussing Russia and sanctions against Russia. And when Salvini sort of like said that he was against these sanctions in a way, she clearly showed her disapproval and because she knows that actually the fact that Salvini might portray himself as too close to Moscow in a way could not be beneficial to her political campaign at the moment. We know as well that, and let's not forget that only a few days ago, US released that, well, the latest US intelligence report actually about possible links between Moscow and foreign parties. We know that the Italian government has been looking into it. So far, it seems that no Italian parties are on that list, but clearly all eyes are on that. This is an issue that is clearly being monitored very closely, not only by the Italian government at the moment, by Draghi himself, but by Italians too.
And Georgia, if I can stick with you just for a sort of follow-up there, what we've seen in other parts of Europe, when there has been a surging right-wing or parties on the right of the political spectrum, it sort of forced the parties on the left to move into their space a little bit more and adopt policies that are maybe less left-wing than usual around issues on immigration, for example, law and order. Is that something that you've seen in this Italian campaign, that parties in the left are having to be a little bit tougher to try and go after some of those votes that might, the floating votes that might drift from left to right?
I think we've seen something different this time around. I think by hearing what Letta has to say, I mean, the leader of the Democratic Party, I think he's really trying to instead represent whatever goes against the center-right, sort of like center-right ideals in a way. So he's actually trying to stress the fact that, using also the issue of the war in Ukraine, that the risk of having center-right, right-wing politicians in the majority and ruling the country could mean as well being closer to Moscow, being more anti-EU, and certainly he's highlighting the fact that when it comes to international relations, Italy might distance itself from the Atlantic Partnership and EU members and that sort of relations. So I think we've seen the left that is actually doing the left in the traditional sense, if you will, this time around. And that's because I think the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis have become really the top issues, the most pressing issues for Italians this time around, because as Andrea was also saying, the problem of increasing energy bills is something that has been affecting both households and businesses across the country.
And if I could stick with you one more time, Georgia. Andrea, I promise we're coming back to you with the next question. But look, just sorry to bang on about this, but we've seen again in other countries, we see it in the UK, we see it in Sweden, that it's not enough for the left-wing parties to be the opposite of the right, to say, we're not them. They needed to have distinctive policies of their own. Is the left doing enough to come up, not just to say we're not the right wing, but to say we're not the right wing, and here's how we would do things differently. Here's our policies. Here's our solutions to the cost of living crisis. Is that breaking through? Do they even have that? Or do they end up spending their whole time just being the opposite of the right?
Well, you're completely right. And I think they've been spending their time just being the opposite of the right because they haven't been able to come up with their own identity, with their own political identity. Clearly, what we are seeing here is the fact that the center left party have somehow failed to present themselves with a more solid identity, with as you mentioned there, with ideas and policies that are unique to them rather than being presented as opposite ideas compared to right-wing parties. And we've seen what happened recently. Even the idea of creating this new coalition, this as it was called, the super coalition of left-wing parties, so Letta with Calenda, that even plan failed because they're not able to actually to remain together, to stick together. One of the main features, one of the things that characterizes the right over here in Italy is the fact that they tend to actually stick together in a different way, and so their voters know that, and that's why they've been loyal to them. So the fact that we've seen left-wing parties that are unable to stick together and to be united in a way, well, certainly doesn't play well for them. And in terms of like voters, it means losing voters along the way.
Giorgia, I'll let you catch your breath. Now I'll move on to Andrea. You've got time for an espresso, Giorgia, because while I talked with Andrea, you did an excellent duty there. Andrea, look, one of the things we talked about is this EU funding for COVID recovery. I mean, it's a hell of a lot of money. It would be transformative for Italy. But again, there's no unity of purpose here among the political parties about what to do with it, how to spend it, what's in the best interests of Italy. What are some of the issues around this, this EU money?
Yeah, so the Recovery and Resilience Plan, or the PNRR, as it's called in Italy, has been a major debating point. Of course, Draghi has been, a supporter of implementing European reforms, and the centre-right, generally speaking, has been more critical, especially Giorgia Meloni. She really made it part of her electoral ticket, in a sense. And there are a variety of things that are controversial. For instance, the deadline, the reforms to the judicial system, and among the centre-right and Brothers of Italy, also reforms to economic competition. So, for instance, opening up beach concessions to tender. That has been something that the Brothers of Italy have been critical of. So we see that there is this overall sense of this fragmentation on how that 190 billion euros should be spent.
I mean, 190 billion is a lot of money, and there are reforms to be made if they want to get the money. And we've talked about how transformative it could be. What kind of areas would the money be spent on? What kind of projects? Are we talking like major infrastructure projects, healthcare, education? Where can the money be spent?
So in a variety of areas, Italy's overall system is often perceived as being somewhat backward and traditional. And for instance, there are pushes towards, renewable energy, moving towards that. Italy currently relies a lot on natural gas. Also digitalizing the Italian economy, judicial reforms, and of course, as I was mentioning as well, market competition, and one major bone of contention is that of beach concessions. It might seem like something rather trivial for people in other countries, but in Italy, the beach lidos are a huge business, and one that has become rather, how should I put it, rather dynastic, in that these concessions haven't been put to tender, and of course part of the plan is to do that, and that's something that Brothers of Italy oppose, and part of the reason why they are seen as being the party that is standing up for small businesses, family-run businesses especially, which is a big sector of the Italian economy.
I love that something as very Italian as Lido concessions on the beach are a sticking point to receiving 190 billion euros of EU funding. It's perfectly Italian. Giorgia, just looking ahead to the future on Sunday, if you could get your crystal ball out, if we're looking at the opinion polls, some of the latest polling, the centre-right coalition, that's the Brothers of Italy, Northern League, and Go Italy, Berlusconi's party, they're polling just over 47% each. The centre-left, the Democratic Party and others, around 28%. The Five-Star Movement, almost at 14%. What is your kind of prediction for how things shake out after Sunday? And it is quite a complicated electoral system using a mixture of first past the post and proportional representation. So I know it's not always easy to get a handle on these things. Where do you think we're going to be at on Monday morning or Monday evening?
Well, yeah, indeed. It's a very complex electoral system this time around. But as highlighted by analysts, well, according to the latest polls as well, it really seems that the right-wing coalition is heading towards a clear majority, both in the Senate and in the lower house. And that's something that, has been highlighted by several polls and several analysts in the past few weeks. Having said that, of course, the surprises could be around the corner. Let's not forget that clearly there's still a week to go with two final rallies actually happening here in Rome. One is the right-wing coalition's final rally on Thursday, and the other one is the Democratic Party's one. But yes, I mean, we'll find out, but it seems that the right-wing coalition might be heading towards a clear victory on Monday.
And Andrea, what would that mean for how the rest of the world perceives Italy? If we're seeing a party, a prime minister in Giorgia Meloni, whose party can very easily trace its roots back to fascism, what would it mean for the world's perception or European perception of Italy?
I think it's very difficult to say. Also, I think there may be a difference between Europe and the world's perception. I mean, we've seen that Hillary Clinton did offer what could almost appear as an endorsement of Giorgia Meloni, which would seem very unlikely given their different political backgrounds, given she said that any time that a woman is elected to office, it's a step forward. So it's hard to say. I think in general, it also depends, first of all, on what kind of policies and program Meloni's prime minister would want to follow, which side of her we would see in Palazzo Chigi, whether we would see the more hardline sovereignist Meloni or a somewhat more mainstream conservative. I think in general, it could make Italy seem a country that is somewhat more isolationist in terms of its overall perspective, a country that is perhaps less willing to collaborate with its European partners, a country that that is aiming for a somewhat more nationalist and possibly protectionist line. Whether that actually is what's going to happen and whether that's what Meloni even wants is a whole other matter. But in terms of its image, certainly I think it would be portrayed as a victory for Eurosceptic forces. And of course, it's a rather controversial thing to even claim that Meloni is a Eurosceptic because she straddles that line as well. She sometimes presents herself as being Eurocritical and other times as an ardent pro-European. So it's very hard to judge. I think we will find out more after the election result.
And Andrea, you said it all depends what kind of prime minister, what kind of Giorgia Meloni we end up seeing. Surely it's all about what kind of Giorgia Meloni is needed to hold her coalition together. I mean, that's the most important factor here for her, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I wanted to pick up on after what Giorgia Orlandi said is that talking about Berlusconi. Now, I do think that as an electoral prospect, in terms of as a figure himself, he has become somewhat irrelevant. I mean, his party only has 7-8% off the top of my head, but he could really tip the scales because the centre-right coalition need his support in order to stay in place. I mean, given the current polls. So he could still have an influence. And Berlusconi has a somewhat more, you could say, mainstream, liberal conservative, Christian democratic, pro-European stance. So it's possible that Meloni will have to, toe the line and not express some of the more sovereignist, policies or ideas that she has. But it's very hard to judge. I mean, before Trump got elected, people were wondering whether he would be also relatively mainstream conservative and that it was all rhetoric. And then we saw that his presidency was considerably more right-wing than some had expected. Of course, it's a very different system, and so you can't compare the two equally. But it's just hard to say what kind of Meloni we will see in office if she gets elected, of course.
Well, that is all from our Twitter spaces today about the Italian election. Thank you so much to my guests, Giorgia Orlandi and Andrea Carlo, and to producer James Thomas for making sure everything runs as smoothly as it possibly can, within the limitations of Twitter, I will say. If you missed anything, you can listen again here on Twitter, and you can follow all our coverage of the Italian election at our website, euronews.com, and on our social media channels, including analysis of the vote results next Monday morning. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.